My name is Don Essich. I was born and I've lived all my life in Carroll County. I was a Carroll County farmer.
And where in Carroll County were you living?
I lived in the old Bachman Valley area,
What was the closest town?
Westminster.
And what was the neighborhood that you grew up in like?
Well, it was very rather rural, although I was only about 3 miles out of town by the road, but it was very rural and had very few close neighbors, unlike today when there is a lot of houses and a lot of close neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
And I grew up on a 150-acre farm, and I had a little land to it later on. We had about 180 acres and fed cattle, a feedlot, and fed cattle and grew the crops. And in 1983, I discontinued the cattle feeding operation and grew just corn and soybeans.
Mm-hmm. And so was that your father's farm?
Well, yes, it was my grandfather, and then my father got it around back in the 40s, and then at the death of my father in 1963, my father had made arrangements for me to buy it from my mother, which I did, and I farmed until 1995 when I retired from farming.
So you lived in the same house the whole time?
Pretty much so.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And how did it change from the time you were growing up till later in
Well,
life? Did you have plumbing and everything?
Yeah,
when you
the
were...
house pretty much had everything, but it was very, not very private because the indoor bathroom, only had a curtain separated in a hallway, and later on, after I got married, we had to petition that off a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of things that have changed, and I fixed the house up and remodeled, and this is what the trend was,
mm-hmm.
and we kept it until I quit farming.
So when you were growing up on the farm, what was your typical day like when you were a kid?
Well, it depended on what season of the year it was.
Mm-hmm.
In the spring, we were trying to get out and get the plowing and the working of the ground caught up so that we could start planting corn in early part of May. And of course, back probably in the 40s, late 30s, 40s, and into the 50s, pretty much everything was plowed up until the late 60s probably, and then we went to no-till. But up until then, you had to kind of use a moldboard plow
Mm-hmm.
and plow the land and then work it down and make a seed bed and then plant the corn.
Mm-hmm.
And later on, when no-till became the way to do it, we switched over, and I ended up no-tilling my land up until I quit farming.
Mm-hmm. Where'd you go to school?
I went to school in Westminster. I graduated at Westminster High,
Mm-hmm.
and I graduated in 1949, and only 11 years. And in 1950, they added the 12th year on, so I could skip 1 year there.
Uh-huh. And where'd you go to church?
I went to St. Paul's United Church of Christ in Westminster.
Is it still there?
It's still there.
Mm-hmm. Do you still go there?
No.
Mm-hmm. What about your groceries? Did you go off the farm for any groceries?
For any what?
Groceries?
Groceries.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we shopped. My folks were involved with the Farm Bureau and the Carroll County Farm Bureau, and they started I guess they called it the co-op grocery store back in probably the early 40s, and so they pretty much shopped at the, it later ended up in Westminster Shopping Center.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just a couple of years ago when Food Line come and bought out everything, and they closed I think they called it the Green Belt consumer cooperative or something like that.
Mm-hmm. How did Westminster change from when you were growing up?
Well, obviously it grew, built new high school. I felt they always had good education in Carroll County, and I had two children who attended and graduated in Westminster and went on to the University of Maryland. Both did. And I felt they had got a good education in Carroll County, public schools, and they certainly changed a lot then because back then you had the elementary school and the high school, and you went.
Those were the only
you
two
didn't
levels.
you didn't have the what they call elementary and middle school,
Right,
and
right.
we didn't have that then.
Right. So what did you do for fun?
Well, it was tough, but in school, last year I always had to work on the farm, but my dad did let me take off and go out for baseball in my last year in high school, and I really enjoyed that. I love sports, but just played around with, especially as you got a little older and you could drive a car, where you'd play with other young people my age, and we'd play, football, baseball, soccer. And,
Did you go to the movies?
went to the movies, and there was a few dances around then, but I ended up probably when I was about 16 going to the roller skating rink up at Town at the Rainbow Roller Rink, and as a matter of fact, I went there for a number of years. I met my wife there.
Oh.
She used to come up. She lived in Reisterstown, and she'd come up with a group that come up from Reisterstown, and we eventually met each other and went from there.
That's great. Let's see. Where'd you guys go for clothes?
Well, we did a lot of shopping at J.C. Penney's in Westminster, and I had another one there. Well, they had several. Mather's was a store up on Main Street, and they had a few other stores. But if you really wanted a variety, we went to Hanover, and they had more stores, more variety up there.
What do you think has changed the most about Carroll County?
Well, I had a cattle feedlot operation, and about the time that the handwriting was on the wall that there was no longer a real opportunity in feeding cattle to do well with it, because we had good corn prices here, because Maryland, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Virginia are all corn deficient states. That means that they use more corn than they can grow. Therefore, we had good markets here because they had to bring the corn in from Midwest, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana. And so it was a cost there to transport the corn in, and the local people who sold corn generally got that as a premium for their grain. And I was no longer getting, a lot of the slaughterhouses where we fattened cattle and sold them for for beef slaughter, and that market all changed. A lot of the slaughterhouses closed down because of environmental concerns, and most of them didn't think that it was opportunity was there. And there was probably 20 or more slaughterhouses around the Baltimore area, or in Baltimore City even, and there's only, I think, one in the city, and one right outside the city limits in Catonsville, and some small little butcher places around Carroll County and around Maryland. But the markets pretty much left, and the opportunity to make money at feeding cattle was no longer here. There's a lot of things that went into that, and that had to be the changing of the feedlots out west, and they had big feedlots where they, fed 5,000, 10,000, 100,000 cattle, and they generally ended up building this slaughterhouse right close to the feedlots, and they fed, in volume and handled cattle, and we couldn't compete. Not if you use the corn, you know, if you priced it at what you could sell it as grain, you couldn't afford to feed it to the cattle because of this good corn market around here. And what made that good was the brewers on the eastern shore of Maryland, and also some dairymen and needed corn, and some hog production, some chicken layers. The brewers were on the eastern shore, and we had some layers around, laying houses around too, as we still do. But that's the big change, is that it's not too many people have livestock any longer. A few dairymen around, or I'd say a few. There's still some dairy farms, but there are less and less of them.
Yeah.
And few people feed a few cattle, but not. Carroll County used to have probably fed more cattle than the rest of the state did as far as fattening beef cattle. It was pretty popular then, and we had some good markets. The markets were in Union Stockyards in Baltimore, and later that was owned by the railroad, and they closed it down, or they moved the stockyards out there. They're called Baltimore Union Stockyards, and they closed it down, and the brokers and the cattle buyers ended up out at West Friendship, and that remained until probably in the 80s, and then that closed down. And so everything has changed, and probably the only close market here is the one here in Westminster. That's out here off of 31.
Right.
And that's a auction market, and they probably sell more beef cattle now than they did when I was feeding cattle, because the buyers weren't there to buy beef. They were in Baltimore or West Friendship, and when I had cattle that didn't suit the buyers here, the butchers here, sometimes they'd have some big cattle, and our butchers around here didn't, and I say around here in Baltimore and around, didn't want big cattle. They didn't want cattle weighing over 1,200 pounds. So we'd take them up to Lancaster, New Holland, or Vintage, and they were auction markets. Lancaster was a Union Stockyards also, but they later became an auction market, and they had good markets up there, as they still do today, because there's a lot of Mennonite Amish farmers and slaughterhouses, small, and they might only kill maybe half a dozen a week or so, maybe a dozen a week, but there's a lot of them, and they continued at it. And whereas Carroll County moved away from cattle, and they still have some decent grain markets, but we all started using, the buyers. R.D. Bauman was one of the buyers. Southern States was a buyer. Monix Grain was a buyer, and probably Lippy Brothers now, I think, buy some grain, so they're kind of branching out into that field now. So.
How would you describe Carroll County to someone who's never been here?
Well, I think it's still, in a lot of ways, relatively rural, but for those of us who grew up here, I would say it's no longer that, but people come here, and I think we still got some open land, and this has to do a lot with the preservation programs that the state has, and Carroll County also has preservation, and it's really preserve farmland, and the state or the county will buy easements and give the owner, maybe some much needed capital to pay debts and keep farming, but he gives up his opportunity to sell building lots in. I mean, he trades that off. They're called easements that they sell either to the county or to the state.
So that's very different than how it used to be.
Oh, absolutely. That was started, I was active in the Farm Bureau back in the 60s and 70s, and this land use became very much a issue and a topic. And I still remember the people who moved into Carroll County. One didn't want it to change and didn't want it to have any development to speak of. They moved in and they would like to keep it like it was, but obviously, there's it's difficult to stop it altogether, and they can put it in around the municipalities, allow the zoning around that to expand a little bit, but you can't now build developments out over the county unless they have the zoning, and that isn't changed very much now.
And water's been an issue lately, water. With developing. So was there an issue with water when you were farming?
No, because there was less people, less wells needed, less water needed. We never had too much irrigation around here, and you get over in the eastern shore of Maryland, they have a lot of irrigation, and they have a lot of water demand over there. It's probably more now than ever. Also with a little more growth. Now we have a lot of growth around here, but water wasn't an issue back then. But now I understand a lot of these developments, they have trouble with the wells, maybe have to re-drilled and hit new water sources, and so I don't know how bad that's going to be. It doesn't seem to be as bad here as it does in other parts of the country yet.
Are there any other things that come to mind about growing up in Carroll County, or any changes you want to talk about?
Not off the top of my head, I can't think what they are, but there are plenty of things that have changed, and a lot of the new residents, come out of some of the metropolitan areas or your urban areas of the larger cities around Baltimore and around Timonium and out of Ellicott City. And
what about your neighbors up here now? Are they mostly from Carroll County? Or do you have a mixture?
At the village, at Carroll Lutheran Village, yes. I live at Carroll Lutheran Village, and I would say maybe a third of them or less are from Carroll County, and most of them are from other parts of Maryland, and some from out of state. I know we have some from Massachusetts, I believe, and some from New York State, and some from maybe West Virginia, some from Virginia, I guess, and I can
East
think,
Coast.
a little bit all around, and but there's a lot of competition now for senior citizens, and so it's a big business now.
Right,
and,
right.
And I guess the competitiveness kind of maybe helps control the costs somewhat, but it's changed even since I moved here. I've been here now 2.5, going on 3 years, and I've seen, of course, the economy has changed here in the last year and a half, and I've noticed that everybody's feeling the crunch, and probably some of the farmers, they've seen some very prices that have moved up and down, and they kind of went with demand with other things, and as the economy changed, so did the demand for maybe some of their grains and some of their products or produce that they produce. And of course your costs, they keep going up and they don't come down too much. And I've seen that change a lot. The demand for fertilizer, for chemicals, and of course for machinery and all
Increase,
that.
I guess.
Yeah. It's fewer farms, but we got some fairly good sized farms, and we, I guess some of the farms are they might even be part-time farmers. There's a lot of people that just have a love of wanting to be on a farm and be a farmer. And some of these folks, when they can afford it, depending on whether they're a professional person or somebody that's done well working, they'll end up maybe buying a small farm, and they'll farm on evenings and weekends, and they just love it. Mm-hmm. And a lot of these people say they wished they grew up in a farm and they could have farmed, but I suspect if they did, well, they'd feel maybe like a lot of us is that, man, it's hard work, and I'm glad when it's over.
Right, right. Well, thanks for sharing those stories about farming in Carroll County.
Mm-hmm. It seemed like that's where we ended up on farming, and that wasn't necessarily the direction you intended, is it? Or
oh no, that's fine.
Okay.
That's fine. That's what you were involved with, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.